Headlines of protests erupting across multiple African countries have dominated mainstream media and social media platforms recently. From the streets of Kenya to Nigeria, Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and beyond, many have taken to the streets to demonstrate their frustrations and stand against local governments. Some are calling it an African Spring, reminiscent of the Arab Spring uprisings that shook North Africa and the Middle East over a decade ago. But what do the actual events that have taken place so far tell us? Is this a regional movement for change, or are we looking at isolated events? Stay tuned as we dive into the stories behind the recent protests in Africa. Welcome to PIHOA Network, where we explore the history, politics, and social dynamics of post-independence Africa. Today, we're going to tackle a big question. Is Africa experiencing a protest-led revolution? Stay tuned to find out. Our story begins in June 2024, when Kenya, long seen as a pillar of stability in East Africa, was rocked by violent protests. It all started with a tax hike that was set to be introduced through the Financial Bill 2024, sparking outrage across the country. Thousands of Kenyans, predominantly the youth, took to the streets in protest. On June 25, 2024, in a dramatic moment that shocked the nation and the world, demonstrators stormed Parliament in Nairobi, forcing lawmakers to flee. They even set fire to parts of the building, seizing the ceremonial mace, a powerful symbol of authority. The protests in Kenya were not just about taxes. It was about a sense of deep betrayal. Just like many other African nations, Kenya, a nation that has struggled with political corruption and economic disparity, had reached a boiling point. After 8 years of drought and widespread unemployment, many young Kenyans felt that their leaders had abandoned them. To put things into perspective, in Kenya, over 75% of the population is under 35 years old, and youth unemployment stands at a staggering 39%. The GDP per capita is about $2,000, yet many of the nation's politicians flaunt their wealth on social media. Additionally, Kenya's lawmakers are among the highest paid in the world, with some earning close to $13,000 a month, more than 6 times the average annual income of a Kenyan citizen. But this video is not about diving deep into the situation in Kenya. To find out more on that recent protest, check out our latest video on this. Link is in the description. The protests in Kenya were just the beginning of what some are referring to as the African Spring. But can we really make that comparison, or could that statement be a little bit too far-fetched? Stay tuned to find out. To give you guys a little bit of context in what this video is all about, and to help you understand the scale and intensity of the protests sweeping across parts of Africa today, it's important to look back at a moment in history that reshaped an entire region, the Arab Spring of 2010. This all began with a single act of desperation in Tunisia. A vegetable seller, Mohamed Bouazizi, set himself on fire in protest after being mistreated by local authorities. Sacrificing himself in this brave act of self-immolation, a spark was lit, setting the Arab world ablaze, igniting weeks of furious protests. Tunisians, already angry at the rising cost of living and years of authoritarian rule, flooded the streets. By the end of it, President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, who had ruled for 23 years, was forced into exile. This wave of protests, fueled by social media, quickly spread across North Africa and the Middle East, hence the name the Arab Spring. People weren't just protesting hunger, they were fighting against oppressive regimes. In the end, 4 rulers were deposed, and the region would never be the same again. Fast forward to 2024, with recent protests that have been taking place across Africa in countries such as Kenya, Nigeria, and Uganda, some analysts are drawing parallels between the Arab Spring and what could be an emerging African Spring. For instance, The unrest in Kenya bears striking similarities to those early days in Tunisia. Once again, social media is playing a pivotal role, helping to mobilize angry, disillusioned young people who feel betrayed by their political leaders. Platforms like Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram have become the frontline for organizing protests and turning online campaigns into real-world demonstrations. To understand the gravity of this movement and how it's spreading across Africa, let's look at Uganda, a country which neighbors Kenya to the west. On July 23, 2024, young Ugandans gathered in the capital, Kampala, for a protest against corruption. Despite a ban on protests and warnings from President Yoweri Museveni, demonstrators filled the streets, calling the removal of corrupt officials. The protest was met with brutal police force. Many were arrested and some remain in detention today. Uganda's political situation is complex. Museveni, who has been in power since 1986, is Africa's third longest serving leader, and under his rule, Ugandans have experienced a steady economic growth, but this prosperity has not trickled down to the masses. The median age in Uganda is just 16 years old, and with a youth unemployment rate of over 13%, discontent is rife. Despite the government's authoritarian rule, the protest in July signaled the youth were no longer willing to stay silent. But the unrest didn't just stop in East Africa. In Nigeria, a country which has Africa's largest economy, joined the wave of protests in August 2024. Over a span of 10 days, tens of thousands of Nigerians took to the streets in protests tagged "End Bad Governance." This is because today, the Nigerian economy is on one of its worst states ever. Food prices have tripled under President Bola Tinubu's leadership, and many families now struggle to eat even one meal a day. Nigeria is a country with immense potential due to the large oil and natural gas deposits. However, it faces daunting challenges impeding it from seeing the true benefit of its rich resources. Despite having Africa's largest GDP, standing at approximately $440 billion, over 40% of the population lives in poverty. That's over 80 million people, most of whom are under the age of 25. Nigeria's youth unemployment rate hovers at around 33%, contributing to widespread frustration. This wave of protests is reminiscent of the End SARS movement back in 2020, when young Nigerians stood up against police brutality. But this time, the protests aren't just about one issue. They're about systematic failures, corruption, inflation, and a lack of economic opportunities. President Tinubu's government has spent over $30 million on luxury renovations and even a new presidential jet, further enraging a population already struggling to survive. So, going back to the question that we started with, are we witnessing a new African spring? Some experts believe that the similarities are undeniable if you look at the events that are currently taking place today to much like the Arab Spring in 2010. These African protests are driven by young people who are angry at their governments and fed up with economic inequality and corruption. Social media is again playing a crucial role, helping protesters mobilize and amplify their voices globally. By comparing both events, we're able to draw parallels and spot clear patterns. The recent arrests in Kenya are very similar to the early days in Tunisia's 2010 revolution, which sparked the Arab Spring. Just as then, social media has become a rallying point for disconnected youth, spreading messages of rebellion across borders. Similarly, in both cases, the local economic conditions are key factors fueling anger, and on top of that, you have broader dissatisfaction with governance. Due to this, the gap between the elite and the rest of the population is growing wider, leading to a sense of hopelessness among Africa's youth. But it's important not to draw too many parallels in each case, as the situation is still brewing and much more is yet to unfold. Africa's political and social landscapes are incredibly diverse, And while the protests in Kenya, Uganda, and Nigeria may share some characteristics, they are still driven by unique local factors. It's important that we keep in mind that protests are not a new thing in Africa. Many countries have seen waves of unrest over the past decade, though they've often gone unnoticed by international media. Take Burkina Faso, for example. In 2014, protests under the banner of La Bataille Citoyenne, or the Citizens' Broom, led to the ousting of the dictator Blaise Compaoré. Similarly, in Sudan, Omar al-Bashir was overthrown after months of protests in 2019. These movements were powerful but did not spark continent-wide revolutions. Therefore, it's crucial to recognize the local nuances at play in each country. Another key thing to note is that these protests often differ in their intensity and scope depending on the country's political climate. For example, protests in Kenya may be less tolerable than in Burundi due to Kenya's close ties with the United States and its role in global war on terror. In Kenya, at least 50 people died in the protests this year and many more remain missing. What is undeniable, however, is that Africa is experiencing a surge in youth-led activism. Driven by dissatisfaction with governance and the economy, this anger isn't unique to Africa. Around the world, young people are standing up and demanding change. It is not coincident that this all comes after the COVID-19 pandemic, as many researchers see this as a significant catalyst to the ongoing events. The pandemic caused a seismic shift in the lives of millions of young people. Economies were devastated, job opportunities vanished, and mental health suffered globally. For many African youth, who make up 40% of the continent's population, the post-pandemic reality has been particularly harsh. Today, African youth are finding new and innovative ways to resist. During the protests in Kenya, young lawyers formed coalitions to help bail out those arrested, and doctors took to the streets to provide medical assistance to the injured. In Nigeria, protesters used digital tools like ChatGPT to translate government documents into local languages, spreading awareness and facilitating action. But just as protesters have adapted, so too have the government. Authorities responded to the unrest with partial internet shutdowns, making it harder for activists to organize. This strategy of digital repression is becoming a common tactic in African nations during periods of political unrest. So, as we ask, is Africa on the verge of a protest-led revolution? The truth is, it's too soon to tell. What we do know is that the continent's young people are increasingly fed up with the status quo, and their voices are growing louder and louder. Whether or not these movements transcend into a continent-wide uprising remains to be seen. But one thing is clear: Africa's youth are demanding change, and their leaders can no longer afford to ignore them. That said, thank you for watching PIHOA Network. If you found this video informative, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on informative content about Africa's post-independence history and current affairs. Let us know in the comment section what you think. Is Africa experiencing a revolution, or are we looking at isolated events? We'd love to hear your thoughts. See you on the next one.